Hey, everybody. Hello and good evening. Welcome to our After the Monument virtual conversation. My name is Audrey DeMola. I'm the Director of Public Programs at Socrates Sculpture Park. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Socrates is a community-engaged New York City waterfront park, an internationally renowned outdoor art museum that was transformed by artists and community from an illegal dump site in the late 80s. Socrates is located in Long Island City, Queens, on the ancestral land of the Canarsie, Lenape, and Matinecock peoples. We offer public art, cultural programming, community services, and an oasis of welcoming riverfront green space 365 days a year for free. So we're very grateful and proud to be hosting this conversation tonight in partnership with Galeria Nara Roesler. I want to give thanks and introduce our panelists. Welcome, welcome to artist Paul Ramirez Jonas, Courtenay Finn, Chief Curator of moCa Cleveland, Kendall Henry, Director, Percent for Art of the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and of course, Jess Wilcox, our Curator and Director of Exhibitions at Socrates Sculpture Park. So our talk tonight will focus on Paul Ramirez Jonas's public artworks, Eternal Flame, which is currently on view at Socrates Sculpture Park as part of the exhibition Monuments Now, as well as Public Trust, which is currently on view at moCa Cleveland. And as a certain very important election is swiftly creeping up on us, some of the topics we'll chat about this evening are public space as contested ground, civic participation, and the role of monuments in the contemporary culture war. So I'd like to let you guys know that you can submit questions for our panelists at any time. We're gonna have a Q&A later in the hour, so feel free to drop it into the chat as we go along. And I am gonna throw the virtual mic over to Jess. Jess, would you like to place Paul's work in kind of the greater context of our current show, Monuments Now?
Yes, thank you so much for that introduction, Audrey. I really appreciate it. And yeah, I think that's the perfect place to start, is just the context of the show, Monuments Now, which we started to conceive in 2017 in response to the kind of controversies of existing monuments that were bubbling up into the sphere. The decision to dismantle the Robert E. Lee monument in New Orleans, and then the controversy around the idea of taking down the Robert E. Lee monument in Charlottesville, Virginia, that then became this sort of flashpoint for the alt-right and white supremacists. And the idea of the show was to not focus on that, shall we take it up? Shall we move it up or down? But thinking about acknowledging that this landscape was changing and thinking about asking artists to conceive of monuments that would come after these kind of heroic type monuments would come down. And of course, Paul Ramirez Jonas, to me, was an obvious choice to, as an artist, to engage in that question because of past works that he has done surrounding monuments, the commons, around civic participation. Even the title of his survey show had the word monumental in it, Atlas plural monumental. So it just really felt like a perfect person to enter in that conversation. And I'm really happy with the projects that he came up with. And so I think, what we're gonna do is play a video that we made as part of the Eternal Flame project and watch that. And then we'll throw it over to Paul to discuss that a little more. But I think the video will be helpful for everyone. Are we playing that now?
I'm always thinking about how to reinvent different monuments so they make sense for us today. One of them is the eternal flame, which usually is supposed to burn forever and remind us of something very abstract like freedom or equality, or perhaps something very warlike like a soldier or a hero. And I was thinking, what is exactly the meaning of the eternal flame? What is eternity and how do we keep things alive? This is heating up. That's good.
This recipe reminds me of childhood. My parents worked 7 days a week, so we had only one day out of the year where we got together and we would gather with other families and we would do a barbecue.
I came to the US as a grad student. I realized that I didn't know how to cook. Ooh, finally, this is heating up. And this recipe was specifically transferring my mom's wok cooking. And this was an attempt to turn that into grill cooking. I've never used a grill before. So not very typical in India, you know?
For us, this reminds us of home, the ocean, the sea, and just being able to cook as a family and do traditional foods together. The codfish is part of our traditional Barbadian type fare. And so it's part of what we all ate growing up. As Pauline said, you know, some of us didn't like codfish. So they made it into patties and added seasons and spices to ensure that we would eat it.
Es una receta que yo aprendí de mi madre. Mi madre la aprendió de mi abuela.
I know my own is a third generation recipe, so from my great grandmother.
Mine is from my grandmother.
To me, it means continuity.
Yes.
Continuity of family, of knowledge, of foods and recipes.
Traditions continuing on in someone's new homeland. Very often it's one of the only things you bring with you from wherever you're coming from. You brought your language, you brought your memories of food from childhood and home. So it's one of the strongest connectors people have to who they are and where they're from.
Totally. I think that's how people remember, that's how communities remember, that's how societies remember.
Por medio de la receta, siempre yo la mantengo como si ella viviera, mi abuela.
Definitely more important to pass on from generation to generation because it's part of our life. We want our children and our grandchildren to know what it is and how we grew up, what we ate. So we definitely want to pass it on.
The memory of my mother's cooking is, for me, it is failure to replicate. And in failing to replicate, you generate a new idiom of your own.
Invariably, these recipes will change. They'll change along with what happens to them while they're here, the friends they make, the bonds they make, connections, and it will be a constant evolution.
Way overcooked. Or not.
Perfect. Both my grandmothers lived for 100 years in this little town in Eastern India. And so I think both their memories are embedded in my parents and then carry into me. And now me in the US is this kind of a coming together of two threads of memories. The way it's just, in some ways, the cooking fire is an eternal flame, where communities and people who are moving and leaving behind something and coming to a new place carry these forms of cooking as that kind of original flame from the heart.
The idea of an eternal flame in relation to food is really beautiful because it's more than memory, it's tradition. It's bringing stuff from the past into the present with our cooking. And it's not just a memorial, it's something we're actually doing and sharing with others all the time. This one is a French bread, and the other one, maybe this is a focaccia.
For us, the eternal flame means longevity. It means continuation of our family traditions and being able to pass our thoughts and our foods and our music onto our children and grandchildren.
immature. This is naturally
The char doesn't go through to the side.
I don't mind the tar.
I can't believe that. Actually, sure, it's a room full of chefs.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah, for playing that video. So yeah, I just wanted, that gives everyone a little bit of background on what the work actually looks like, how people were using it. But I think that, one of the best places to start is asking Paul, because you have made other artworks that are monuments for other contexts. And I hoped you could just talk a little bit about why, the Eternal Flame at this moment for Socrates Park.
Yes, thank you. Thank you everyone for being here in this strange new format that we're all getting used to. The idea of after the monument that this conversation is titled is like, to me, it's like, well, what comes after these monuments, but also after, as in like when you're an artist and you make something after another artist. And it's interesting because at some point I realized that there really are less or just about a dozen monumental forms that we have in our culture. And it's a really interesting list because it's actually, I was going to say in the West, but it is so old that it's not even really from the West. It's like we can go as far back to Mesopotamia and the Egyptians who have passed on some of these monuments, right? So I'm always interested in like, well, what can we do with the column? What can we do with the pyramid? What can we do with the bas-relief? What can we do with the triumphal arch? And all of these have this really thousands and thousands of years of DNA. And sometimes they feel like a straitjacket, right? Because I'm like, they're so old and you see them repeated over and over, and can you really ever breathe new life into it? So when you said, let's do monuments now, I was thinking a lot about how can people use the monument. And I had a very formal, almost mystical experience once where I went to Central Park and I sat all day on the USS Memorial that's right at the corner of Columbus Circle. And I just observed how people related to that monument. So it was interesting how it is a monument for the dead sailors of the USS Maine. And supposedly, there people at that time want to pass that sentiment onto the future that this was terrible. And let's not forget these sailors, but none of that is working with that monument. What's working is that people are using it to have lunch. People are using it as a meeting point. Stretchers are using it as structure to stretch their muscles before they go running. And so for Socrates, I could think like, well, how can we make some monuments that are useful? So I'm always trying to imagine like, how can they be relevant and how can they be relevant for a long time? So I know we went through a bunch of different things, like I was thinking like kind of flagpole be used to dry laundry, and one of the things that I kept thinking is I live near Prospect Park and I see how people go and barbecue, and you have this amazing variety of people, all the diasporas, all the people who come to New York from different countries, from different parts of the country are cooking, but they're not interacting with each other. And simultaneously, the park has a lot of monuments. So I just thought of something very simple, like, can the monument become the barbecue? So it serves a purpose. And also, so it creates these sight lines. So each party that is cooking, the chefs can see each other through the monument and maybe have a moment where they interact and exchange information. And and then it dawned on me that I kept thinking I was making a structure, but then I realized, oh, I'm reinventing one of those few forms, which is the eternal flame, which is also, the eternal flame is a monument that we've had for thousands and thousands of years. So that's sort of like the origin of the piece, but that's often the origin of most of my pieces. So for example, when I made Key to the City, I was thinking a lot about the triumphal arch, which is really just comes out of that cities used to have walls and they were gated, and that people who were not from the city that were trusted were given the keys to the city, and they were literally keys to that gate, so they could go through the wall of the city.
It's kind of a happy accident melding the fact that the obelisk is kind of the same shape as a chimney or a smokestack, and sort of making what is already there in service to the people of the park. It's I mean, this we obviously produced, and you created your own style, but it's essentially taking a ready-made and making it into a monument, transforming it into a monument.
Yeah, and the other thing I'm interested in is also how do things interact with the cityscape and the rules of the city. So to me, it's really, really important that this is an official designated barbecue zone by the New York City Parks Department, because when you work in the public realm, there are so many rules, and you can either use your traditional training as an artist, which is a little bit of, very modernist and avant-gardist. It's like my way or the highway, or you can see all these rules as of enhancements to your creativity and see like, well, the same way that we reinvent the monument is how can we work within these rules to eke out something else? So, so that transformation of the space in this official manner is really, really something that matters to me a lot. And for me, when I know something has really worked is when it sort of enters a moment where it escapes my hands, and right. So like we made this film because we thought that we would never actually be able to allow the public because of the pandemic. So this was going to replace the public programming, but then things eased up in New York and now people can use it. But then Jonathan Forgash, one of the chefs, was so excited. He said, like, we want to make our own film. Is that okay? And I'm like, yes, of course. This is for you to use in whatever way you want. So I was there on Monday for the taping of this documentary. And that's when it's working, because it's like, I don't really know what's going on. They've organized this. They're really interested in each other. No one cares that I'm the artist. I kept asking like, well, is anyone going to ask me questions for the film? No. I even had a great conversation with two of the chefs who thought that this was not very good as an artwork, that it was great as a barbecue, but not very great as an artwork.
But maybe not as an artwork, but in a way great as a monument because they made it their own,
Right, but that is a true sign of ownership, which is like when I always say when a monument is successful, the authorship peels away, right? It's like,
right.
No one goes to see the Statue of Liberty because it was made by whomever that French guy was, or,
right.
Yeah. In fact, they become authorless, successful monuments. So that's sort of when I know that I did a good job, is when that same effect starts to happen around a public work that I made.
Yeah. And the idea of, what is it a monument to, and who it's for? I really feel like the public has taken that on, taken that up on its own. I don't know what you would say, like what it's a monument to or who it's for, but in conversations with some of these chefs, I think they have a very clear idea in terms of being professional cooks and the heritage that they're passing down through generations, through the continuation of cooking as a tradition.
Yeah, it's interesting. Everyone gets it. The chefs get it, right? They because they pass on recipes. So again, it was, I always think like the work has to leave space for the participant. It can't be so full. It's hard to participate in something when there's no space for you. So as an artist, it's counterintuitive, because sometimes I feel like, that's always something that is in the back of my mind as a worry, because it's like, is this piece too simple? Is this piece too simplistic sometimes even? But at the same time, it's a tension. If I, quote unquote, fill it up too much or over define it, then why would anyone participate in a meaningful way, right?
Right.
So yeah, for the chefs, it's a very meaningful thing, and they get it. And also for the weekend visitor, it might simply be a place to picnic and barbecue while they're looking at the work of the other artists.
Which is okay.
Which is fine too, yeah.
Yeah.
I want to be mindful of time, because I forgot to turn on my timer.
Right. No, absolutely. Well, I was going to say maybe then we can move over to Courtenay to talk about public trust in Cleveland. And, I hope, at points you'll chime in as well, Paul. But I think we should give the floor to Courtenay.
Thanks, Jess, and thank you everyone for being here. So yeah, this is what you're looking at are images of our installation of public trust outside moCa Cleveland on Toby's Plaza, which is the plaza that the museum shares with University Circle. It sort of overlaps with Case Western University, the Cleveland Institute of Art, the Cleveland Institute of Music, and butts up against the University Hospital complex. So it's a pretty big thoroughfare. You can't really see in this image, but it leads into a sort of strip mall of dining establishments and picnic tables. And like a lot of institutions, we rethought our programming in light of the pandemic. The museum just actually opened on October 1st. And as we sort of stretched and expanded what we're doing, Paul and I were actually working on a project as part of a larger show called F as in Frank. And we talked a lot about what it would mean to do and to install public trust outside, what it would mean for institutions to take the work outside of the museum and meet people kind of where they are. And it's funny, I think about this piece, I think a lot of people think about it in relationship to a monument or to monumental mentality because of its sort of grandiose nature and how huge it is that the marquee has been blown up so large. And just really quick for folks that don't know, we activate it 3 days a week, Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. So every day that it's activated, Paul texts us headlines that he pulls from the news, and we install them with the date. And then the middle 3 rows that you can see right here on the slide, it says, "I promise not to waste this time with you," is reserved for the participants' promises. And so we've been having these really interesting interactions with folks, talking about what is important to them, about promises as a sort of structure that holds society together, about the value of our words. And while the piece itself is monumental in scale, the thing that I've been thinking about as the actual monument is really the written document that gets created, which sort of collapsed this poetic intimacy of a single person and a single experience into a sort of overall sweeping context of the current moment. So an individual's promise, it's something that they've shared publicly with a stranger at the table, but also with the general public by putting onto the marquee, gets preserved in this document. It's made in 2 copies, one that stays with the project and will ultimately go to Paul, and then one that they get to take home and keep. And I've been thinking a lot about the drawing as the monument, and that sort of gesture as a way of collectively making a monument. And I think a lot about how monuments are always thought of as repositories of collective memory, but that's really a false construct to begin with, because no one remembers the same event the same way. And so what does it mean to create a living monument that is not only changing every day as the news changes, but changes with each person who sits down and participates? And it's been particularly meaningful for me because I've also been facilitating it. So on Saturdays, actually that's me doing a pinky promise with a woman and the baby. But it's being staffed actually entirely by folks who work at moCa. So it's a mixture of our engagement guides, some of our education staff, some of our installation crew, our exhibitions manager. And so we've sort of formed this kind of caretakers, and in some ways we're caretakers of the artwork that comes through our institution always, but in this case we're really facilitating it and able, rather than just putting it up and sort of making sure that nothing bad happens to it, we're actually part of it, and in a way that I think at this moment where the sort of trust between institutions and the value of the words that we speak really matters, has become very poignant, I think, for all of us participating.
Yeah, it's actually, when I say that you need to leave space for the viewer, for people to participate, I thought in this one, quite literally, because, it's like, it's just a wall of names, and you walk through the city and there's big inscriptions and public figures or the status quo, like who gets to inscribe public space? We don't, right? So I called these promissory statements that are made that are deemed important enough to be amplified by media, right? So I just go and I Google news last 24 hours, and the keywords are promissory, like vow, pledge, commit, I will, and then I curate this little, like nugget of promises that we're being constantly made by people who are more powerful than we are, and then they just frame that eye of the viewer. And Courtenay, you're right. It's like how do you pair the kind of the small and ephemeral that's more to our scale and intimate with the big and grandiose, and like a perfect artwork, public artwork would take not freedom and equality and then grandma, but they would actually take both of them and make something like, I care about equality and freedom and equality, and I care about grandma, and I see a relationship between the two, and I don't know how to do that without performativity and that's always something in the back of my mind.
Yeah, and I think it comes across, I mean, for me, this is a living monument, and I think also interesting, you've mentioned, and Jess as well, this idea of permanent, the idea of that monuments are, we think of them as permanent or meant to last forever, and what do temporary monuments mean, and who are they for? And this is a work I think is interesting because it exists in the moments in which it's erected and facilitated, but then it can appear in multiple locations. So I've been trading text messages with Nora Abrams at the MCA Denver, where this piece is also installed, and just comparing the kinds of promises in the stories.
Yeah.
And so the idea that it can take on different meaning and different contexts for different people simultaneously, and that it adjusts to the moment that we live in, the way that we are also adjusting to the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what it makes it kind of a strong or successful monument, is that relationship between the past and then the present, and I say the future too. And I think Eternal Flame does this in a different way, but one of the things that struck me, Courtenay, was when you said like the monument is the written document, and also thinking about the relationship between the monument and an archive as well, and in the different ways that they hold memory and they hold the past. And I just, with archives, one thing I love about them is because it's kind of accumulation of voices and, very much representation of a collectivity of voices. It's never kind of fully complete. Mm-hmm. And that comes across in archives very well. Whereas I think in traditional monuments, the kind that people are taking now, where they're bronze heroes, tries to present a very like complete idea of the history and the past, and this is the way we get over it, and this is how we think about the future. But the sort of messy archive as monument does better monument memory work, maybe.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. There's something about the fragmented or pieced together nature of works like this, and the same with Eternal Flame, where the more people who participate, the longer the thread goes and the more robust it gets. So it's actually stronger by the greater the participation, and it always has the potential to continue, and you can still look back and forward at the same time.
Yeah, one of the biggest professional jealousies I have is of Storycorps, right? Because Storycorps did not begin as something that was going to last forever and end up in the Smithsonian and having a weekly NPR special where they feature one. But I love that it had enough support and interest from the public that it gathered momentum, and it has a form of permanence now, in the sense, both permanence that it's an archive and it's going to the Smithsonian, and permanence that it remains active and it's multiplying, right? And it's like in multiple cities. And now there's kits. So if you want to add someone to Storycorps that is not has no mobility, you can take it to them. And I'm really interested in these kind of cultural phenomena where as a people, we kind of slightly take over that singular authorship of the monument. And
because what makes the monument meaningful or successful is how people interact with it, and the feelings that they feel, that want the desire to participate. And that's why I think sort of this, we wanted to do this speculative show of monuments now, because the temporary monument kind of allows for that prototype. So it could allow a monument to fail and be like, oh, we're not doing that again. Or it can allow people to really get behind it and say, this is a monument, this is what we want to keep doing, rather than having something, just plop down and then you realize everybody hates it. Yeah. So mindful of time, I think maybe we should move on to Kendall, who I think is nice to round out this conversation. Familiarity with Paul's work, of course, and we have the artist perspective, the perspective of a curator working in a non-collecting contemporary art institution, someone working in a public park, and then of course, I think, Kendall has sort of the widest purview in terms of thinking about monuments, in terms of like his domain is New York City, which is a special, unique challenge, but a really exciting one. So yeah, we wanted to hear about your, thoughts and feelings on some of these temporary or more ephemeral approaches to monument makings that hopefully successful, and what the future of those might be in the city.
So the thing is, I really appreciate what Socrates is doing with this Monuments Now exhibition and monuments like what Paul has put forward, because this is like an exploration of you sort of doing the work a little bit of what we can't do in terms of trying to figure out what a new monument is, or what a monument is, or what sort of other ways you could realize a monument and redefining it. And so that's where we are. Not a lot, but almost all the work that I do as the director of the Percent for Art program is permanent work. And in creating that permanent work, we may not have the facilities or the infrastructure within the project to do a temporary based work. And so we sort of go into it, full throttle, and, and what ends up being the monument is what it is. And so it's sort of trial by fire situation. But looking at, works like what Paul is doing, and I study the work quite a bit because, you explore a lot of the monuments, like you said, and sort of really take from that some ideas or some approaches or some ways of thinking about space and public space, and try to incorporate it into working with artists to create the more permanent monument. But I do get to work with some of our city agencies to do temporary work. And I sort of pulled together two pieces that I was involved with very recently. One being one of the Black Lives Matter murals throughout the city. There are 8 of them. Most of them are done by the city just as a statement in yellow in one of the 5 boroughs as an exercise, because it was done in DC. But I was, I was involved with that peripherally because it's a DOT project, and I'm on the committee for DOT, blah, blah, blah. But this one that I have up on the screen was one that I curated, and I wanted to be involved with this one in particular because of its location. If you don't know Lower Manhattan, you don't know this particular area, there are quite a few monuments within this image alone. And one is smack dab in the middle of it, which is Triumph of the Human Spirit by Lorenzo Pace, which is a Percent for Art commission. North of that is the African Burial Ground by Rodney Leon. It's an architect. There is a Thurgood Marshall courthouse there, which is a kind of memorial, I guess. And this is surrounded by One Police Plaza, which is police headquarters. This is surrounded by, the Supreme Court and the courthouses. This is surrounded by, the federal building where if you want to become a citizen or you have sort of immigrant issues, then you have to go through there. So all of these, this is surrounded by a lot of these institutions that have, quite a great effect on the Black life, right? And so creating that mural within that space was very important. And it's a memorial on many different, the words itself is a memorial on many different levels, because to get this particular view, you have to be in the courthouse or have you have to be in the courthouse. But when you're going down to the level of the street level, this really speaks to, a different kind of way. So the next slide. And so each of the words were created by 3 different artists with all emerging, coming from different backgrounds, different religions, different sexual orientations. And so you have TJ Mohammed, which is which is an artist from Ghana who lives here in New York now, and who's really referencing his inspiration was what it means to be Black, and really using that history of being an African living in America, and really taking on some of the symbols that are in the African burial ground itself. On the Lives mural, which is done by Sophia Dawson, she wanted to really make a memorial within a memorial, really referencing in the L, these are the women whose children were murdered through police brutality. And she also references, the original Black Lives Matter group, the Black Panthers in the E, and so forth. So this is, and then you have Patrice Payne in the, what it means to sort of be a Black person now, and its historical context in this world now. So this is a very important space to have this statement, even more so than what the other 7 are, because it speaks to the people who are, who occupy this space. It's sort of almost reclaiming this space as, and sort of really emphasizing that Black lives do matter. This is also when a lot of the protests begin in Foley Square, this is where they start, and then they disperse throughout the city. So there's a lot happening there. There's a lot of layers and meanings that the hope was to sort of get people on different levels of perception to understand what it is that's being seen here. And the next slide is another project that, that I was involved with, being part of the Department of Transportation's Art Committee, is the Boulevard of African Monarchs by Kenseth Armstead. And this is a piece that was recently installed at the 116th and Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard, Junior Boulevard in Manhattan. And, you're very familiar, Jess, with Kenseth because he's done stuff at Socrates. And I'm loving this piece for a lot of different reasons. And there's something about the creation of monuments and seeing the hand of the artists in it. Mm-hmm. And if anyone has a chance to go see, this is going to be up until next August 2021. And you understand how this is made, you feel the soul of the artist within this piece. You feel the architecture around it. If you do not know the reference that is made historically in Africa, it sort of comes to life. And there's something about having the soul, and going back a little bit, when people ask me, well, what makes a good monument? I don't know what that answer is, right? But I know when there is there's some aspect of it where you feel that it has, this is weird to say, it has a soul, it has sort of usefulness, people are engaging in it. And, I did go to Socrates quite a few times because it's just up the street from where I live. And I sat down and looked at Paul's piece for a little bit. And there's something about when you see the charring of the grill, the little bits of leftover, maybe food, or it feels like it's been used. It sort of has this sort of soul in it, and that you cannot get from a statue, on a bronze statue on a pedestal. These things to me are soulless, and I'm sorry to say this right now, but there's something about this piece and that piece and the types of, you feel the people within the monument itself. And that's, I think, what's important. And going back to the Black Lives Matter piece, looking at this piece by Kenset, looking at sort of the pieces in Socrates right now, you feel the persons are in there, the people that you're memorializing are in there. And I think that's very important. And so that's my 2 cents.
I was just that last I really am happy you said that, because I think one of the kind of key responsibilities of a monument, if you can say a monument has responsibilities, is, the fact that it's in public space, and in that, and its representation, taking up space, being monumental, exerting its power, it has a responsibility to the idea of the collective, and being able to see the individual in that collective, because it's, monuments are symbolizing a larger, something bigger. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's nationalism. With Black Lives Matter, it's kind of like that movement. And then each of the letters have these individual stories. And, that's what I feel like allows people to connect to it and feel that soul. Because, I've been mentioning throughout, like, this idea of like successful monuments. And I think mm-hmm. that's what makes it successful, because I don't know, there's this, philosopher, Robert Musil, who has this famous quote that there's nothing so invisible as a monument. They're made to take up space, but you just walk right by them and don't know what they mean. And I think, a successful monument has that soul that will bring you in.
Yeah, and that definition is the old one we're trying to get away from, you see?
Yeah.
And so that's why, doing these kinds of projects, and because I think when we think of a monument, we want it to say, well, I matter, and that's why I'm doing this, that my experience mattered, my culture matter. So that's why it's sort of important to take the time to sort of do these kinds of spaces with what I call the soul in them.
Right. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because we want to say they matter and not be done with it. Mm-hmm. Like, I love the Black Lives Matter, because when I put my nerdy public art hat, I'm like, it's such a loaded site. You would think it's impossible to do something, and yet it literally stays within the lines. Mm-hmm. Like literally, like nothing is broken, no law is broken, no regulation is broken. But I also think that's where's the hope, right? It's ephemeral, but the city has to repaint those white lines for the traffic and the crossing. And I could imagine a hopeful future where the Black Lives Matter horizontal mural is repainted every time the street is maintained. Mm-hmm. So it's not like, well, we celebrated this and then we moved on. It's like, no, and every 2 years, city workers come and they reinscribe it. It still matters, right? Mm-hmm. Until it doesn't. And then, but maybe the warmness comes, we're afraid of lack of permanence, but there's a permanence that comes from repetition, right, of the action. Mm-hmm. that is, I think we're like really close to cracking that, where like the city can produce permanence through this other means.
Yeah, and when we were creating that mural, it's 600 feet long. It takes up 3 blocks, and so it was designed to not interrupt the crosswalks, for example, because that is a working street, and there are rules of people being able to cross. But even if that mural doesn't last in perpetuity, there's something else that happened within that. So the artist who did the live, Sophia Dawson, she's an artist in residence now with the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. So, and so those residencies are meant to really change or alter or influence, city policy around certain things. So, it's sort of like, I said this, or we allowed her to say this, or we made her say this. So what else can she say in a position that could make a real change within this particular subject matter? So although it may not last forever, because I don't think it will, and although it may not be painted over because it was done by individual artists and not a generic yellow one, so it could live on in a different kind of way, so which is very important.
But I think it lives in the experience of both those who helped collectively create it and then those who experience it. So it has changed the landscape of that situation, even if just for a short amount of time. And the idea, we're so used to thinking that our landscape is only able to be changed, I think, at least by like large scale entities, corporations, governments. The idea that we can do that together, I think, is incredibly powerful as a gesture of what a monument might be.
Yeah, and I love what you just said there, because that's how I think of Eternal Flame, and that's why I kind of hope to always create whenever I'm commissioning a monument, because in the end, it's not the thing, the object or the sculpture, whatever it is, that's sort of like the artifact of the process, which is more important, I think. So the act of people cooking and, conversing and learning and, that I think is more important than just the sculpture itself, Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's generating a process. I had an amazing experience when I spent a month in Laos, in Luang Prabang, and it's like it's a UNESCO heritage site, and they have these statues of the Buddha made of wood, and then the monks were telling me that they're thousands of years old, but of course it's wood. It's the monsoon arrives. It's super insane there, like the weather. And they're like, yeah, and we have to recarve it like every couple of years, like an insane amount of times. But the idea that it's perceived that this statue is really old, but it really is only a few years old. It's just being remade constantly. And I feel like how, in a way, that's the way our ideals should be, right? Like if we don't believe in them, why are they still around? And do we really think that committing them to stone and bronze is going to stop us from forgetting, right? So if it matters, it will matter.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
One thing I was rereading the script, Paul, your script for Public Trust earlier today, and a word stuck out at me, and that was the word service. You asked the kind of interlocutors or the speakers asking for the promises to think about the work of service. And I thought that was a unique word to think about in relationship to monuments, like how they provide a service to the public in so many ways. And Eternal Flame, it's quite literal, it's a functioning grill, but also as the service as like a space to enact these different ideas about civic participation, about how to work with the city, and I just think, Kendall, working with the city, you're like literally a civil servant, which is not always, I think, the way people think and talk about monuments. But I wondered if that resonated with any of you.
Yeah.
No, go.
No, good.
No, it's say like I think a lot about service in terms of service versus authorship. They're not exactly opposing, but I feel like you notice bad service and good service is kind of slightly invisible, right? But it's all manners of support. Like right now we're saying, essential workers, and our new heroes are people doing support work, and we only notice support work when it doesn't work. right now, Shannon Jackson writes about that. It's like, you only notice the road when there's a pothole in it, you know? And I feel like, I think a lot of like, how do you create form that is good service? Because otherwise you're disrespecting the viewer and the participant.
Yeah, I mean, it's what you just said really resonates, this idea that when things work, we aren't celebrating or paying attention. It's only when they don't work that sometimes that happens. And in particular, in thinking of service. And for me, it's really tied to care and like an ethos of care. And especially with these works that, you know, it's not just Paul in the studio producing something that gets installed. It's a collective effort to create the artwork. And with Kendall, like the amount of people that you have to talk to, plus the different artists that made the different, like it's really building something together. And I feel like that process carries through into the work. You can feel it in the work, but then it's also consistently repeated. And so, yeah, I think a lot about that relationship between service and care, and like, who are we in service of, and why, and how are we doing it with care, and carefully to care for those that we're serving.
Yeah, and I love teaching, and that is actually one of the things that it's very hard to break, which is that we still train artists to work alone, because you know, artists are geniuses, and it's their unique talent that makes the work, so therefore they must work alone. And so like, we don't have structures that allow for both training or acting in the way that things really are made. When you make something in public space, it is just like, I mean, the authorship is like this, right? It's like someone misunderstands what you said, and then they repeat it better, and then you're like, yes, great, you know? It's like every time I go to Socrates, like Chris and Jess, and everyone has an opinion, and it's like, well, you go with the best opinion of the team, you know? So I was like, round chimney, and you know, Chris is like, octagonal, you know? I mean, not octagonal, pentagonal. It's like, right, pentagonal, you know? So, right, if you work together, the thing makes itself. And there's a better chance that will have better values, right? But Kendall, this, I mean, well, anyone who works in an institution knows this, right?
Yeah, I mean, and you sort of touched on it a little bit. It's sort of, you know, it's impossible. There's no way of, the individual is lost in a lot of these processes. And that could pose a bit of a challenge, particularly when you're looking to sort of elevate the voice of an artist, let's say, in realizing something. So it's the support system is great, but you know, the support system the artist could be lost within that support system if their concept or their sense of self is not strong, you know? So, you know, talking about the Socrates piece there with around chimney versus a octagonal one, you know, if it didn't change the concept of your work, it sort of enhanced it. Whereas, you know, in my world where, you know, we're putting artwork in non-art spaces or spaces that have very different, you know, missions or purposes, and we interjecting art within that, you know, that could get lost very easily. And that's a challenge for the artist and for us, because we want to respect the artist's view. So.
Yeah, I always say when you're doing public works, you have to be very reasonable as an artist and create all this goodwill. So there's that one moment where you're like, no, this has to be this way. But then you must have a lot of goodwill in the bank, so to speak. So you can say, and this needs to be this way. And then everybody goes like, that makes no sense, but he's been so reasonable that we'll just let him do this.
I have the same theory as a curator, where you say yes up until the absolute point where you have to say no. And by then people feel the same way about you.
Yeah, it goes both ways. So collective process for collective product. I see we have Audrey back, and I think you might be here to relate some of the questions from the audience.
Yes, exactly. And thank you all for such wonderful and generative conversation. Thank you guys so much. Yeah, so and thank you all for popping some questions in. I'm gonna take one from Ida. Can you talk more about the relationship of time to the monuments? Is permanency the underlying problem? Should all successful monuments be ephemeral and temporary?
Who's going to try that one? Paul, you start, Paul.
Yeah, I'll start.
Well, I don't know. I have done two permanent works of art, and the contract said that I was on the hook for 60 years only, or something. It was something really funny that permanence was legally defined as, I interpret it as like, I would be dead, so you can't come after me.
Right.
But it is a particular human hubris, right, to want to make it forever. I don't know, but and maybe it's a false dichotomy. Maybe permanence has nothing, or impermanence has nothing to do with making it successful or not successful. But certainly the desire to make it permanent seems like it could easily mislead you. And in terms of processes of commissioning and everything, that's definitely the case, where it's like, I remember that the first time I was ordered a percent for the arts project, I said, well, it was so much money and I was really young and I just seemed crazy. So I said, why don't we make a trust with all this money and then we spend what it does every year on something very ephemeral, and they're like, no. It's like, well, don't you believe in capitalism? The trust will last forever.
Yeah, I mean, the money couldn't be spent that way. So that's why.
That's why, right, yeah.
So we have actual definitions of permanent and temporary for the city. Permanent is 30 years. Temporary is less than 1 year. And so, but I think, yeah, and I agree with Paul that you can't, whether it's permanent or not, that's not any indication of whether it could be successful or not. But there is something quite attractive about temporary and ephemeral work. We have noticed that the process of commissioning that work is a little more fluid. The end results are tend to be a little more contemporary. It's about what's happening now. And as a result of that, it could be a little more exciting. And a big part of public art is sort of trying to avoid controversy, right? And so with a permanent piece, that's harder to do, because if there is controversy around it, it's up for 30 years and you won't have to deal with that and people don't want to see it up. But when something is temporary, we like, yeah, it's controversial, it'll be gone in a month, it'll be gone in half a year. And so that's the excuse. And that kind of, people are sort of cooler about that. So, but I do appreciate the temporary work, because there's so much more you can say, and you could say it quicker, and you could say it with such fervor that if the idea changes later, then that's okay. Whereas permanence, the perception of it might change, but the piece is stuck, you know, so.
So, I mean, I work with all temporary work. So also just to be, there's somewhat, the grass is always greener. I actually really like working with temporary works, but to play devil's advocate, I think there's something kind of interesting in work, monuments that are permanent, and even beyond the city's definition of permanent, where that's 30 years. Thinking about monuments whose meaning has kind of morphed and taken a life. I'm just thinking of the Statue of Liberty, which was originally conceived as a means to honor the Civil War and the emancipation of Black Americans from chattel slavery. And so it had this one kind of narrative. And the way we see it now, most people don't know that narrative. It's seen as, because of its location near Ellis Island, it's associated with this kind of story of American immigration, and that has been so long-term, so permanent, that this narrative, it changed and it became something else. And to me, that's also kind of successfthat, that it had this longevity and open-endedness of, how to interpret the work. That to me, that's kind of successful. But I mean, that's clearly a very exceptional monument. Most permanent monuments are not the Statue of Liberty. So,
But I think for me, you hit on something that's very important, whether permanent or temporary, which is that there's an ability for the thing to change, be it the object itself or people's understanding or interpretation. And then that is sort of allowed as part of the living process. And I think the thing that happens for me that makes a lot of quote unquote permanent monuments more like relics is that their ideas become outmoded or outdated, and they're no longer things we want to carry with us. And how do we put that down, or we want not to erase it because we want maybe these threads to the past, but we don't need to live with it in the same way because it hasn't evolved alongside us, or the narrative around it hasn't evolved. And so for me, that's maybe where something is more or less successful, is its ability to sort of adapt, or our ability, like there's some sort of a relationship between the monument and the public that is two-sided and not maybe one-sided.
Right. Yeah, and then it just disappears. It just disappears because nobody, or because the meaning have changed in a negative way, where you get more information about the individual that's being memorialized as a situation, and then what was positive, before is quite negative because you get to see it in a new light. So it's
right. And as it's funny because as an artist, I'm like, oh, it's a formal problem, right? It's like, how do you create a text that can be reinterpreted? Like, you have to think of the monument as a text. So I'm often think of the theater. It's like, we take a play, it's like 500 years old, and we're like, well, what can we do with this play now? We're going to stage it as anti-war. Or no, now we're going to stage it as pro-government. Now we're going to stage it as let's play it for laughs, and in the malleability of that kind of text, if we are going to do permanence, then we should at least strive for these permanent inscriptions to be malleable, right? So that maybe we don't take the Confederate general down because we can still somehow use it. We're like, well, it's about how war traumatizes the soldier. I don't know, and like if it had been made in that way, maybe we would still have value for it. I don't know, maybe that was unsavable, but
wow, guys, thank you. I won't keep everyone on Zoom all night because there's oh my god. love what you all are saying, and we do have a bunch of questions coming in. I'd like to hit two more actually. So this one is from Yela, and again, apologies if I'm mispronouncing your names. I'm curious to hear from Paul if he was thinking about ancient places of worship, specifically the monument as the temple, which was a place that people gathered to cook / serve animals to the gods. To me, that is what that sculpture relates to.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that, but retroactively, I did think about when I was investigating the eternal flame, I bumped into what the Zoroastrians who worship fire, one of the main things they worship in their temple is fire, is how the fire is made. And they're really like, well, it's back to this idea of performativity and permanence. Like this fire in India is like thousands of years old because we actually moved it from another temple that we had like in Iran. And so we carried the flame. And then if the flame ever goes out, there's a recipe of how to make the flame. It's like you have to go catch like an ember of someone who's being cremated and a fire from someone who is forging steel, and then you mix all these fires to make the Zoroastrian fire. And but so I wasn't thinking specifically about that, but it's again about usefulness. And what's interesting is when I try to think of guidelines or guideposts, I find very few in the modern era. Like I think more about like the fountain in a medieval city that had aesthetic value, but it was really literally the source of water for the neighborhood. So most examples that I find are pre-modern, right? Where it's both sculptural and artistic, and it's also extremely useful and integrated into life.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's so interesting.
And those are some of the, in terms of permanent, so those are some of the longest standing monuments that you're looking at.
Right.
So another question, this is from Betsy regarding public trust. Since it began and is ongoing, will it be considered a monument to a particular moment in history? Do you imagine that it would have a definition that is constructed and finite over time, in hindsight?
Coincidentally has the two times, well, that's not true, but twice it's been shown very close to the election. So I think, but then it was also shown in Mexico City, actually there was the Mexican election was happening at the time. I don't know, because I'm with Courtenay on this, that I think the real output of that piece are those individual drawings and how the things in the drawings age differently. Like the person's promise is going to age differently than the promises that were uttered by public figures. And I think there's more of a chance that it will reach permanence as those individual unique works that it's kind of like publishing and circulating out.
Yeah, I think so. For me, I've been thinking about it in relationship to storytelling, or to like Felix Gonzalez Torres's paper stacks, where the work is the stack, but the work is also the individual paper with each individual person who moves it through the world. So it's both and, which I think is really powerful and exciting. And in some ways, the experience that people have, I think, is the sort of, and the weight that has, or how they recollect it or sort of re-engage with it over time is the thing. And what happens when you encounter it again. That's the thing about redoing the work that I think is interesting, is that there is the ability to discover it again later in life, or at a different context in your own life, and make another promise or reflect on the promise that you made when you encountered it the first time.
And Felix Gonzalez Torres is like a giant in the room, right? Because like that was so influential for me as a younger artist. And then you walk into someone's home and they've remade their own version of Perfect Lovers. You know, I've even seen it as two of those cats that like move their hand and move their tail and like.
Yeah, I have it as a tattoo.
Right, and you recognize it immediately. You're like, oh, Perfect Lovers.
Yeah, well, I think one of the important things that is not just about permanence versus temporary, but this idea of continuation or repetition. And, you know, I feel like that's very much part of the Eternal Flame and Public Trust and all of the work that we've been doing. And, you know, Kendall, that you've been doing, populating the city over time, having it become an archive of its own. So yeah, I think that might be a good place to wrap up.
Yeah, and that was so funny, Courtenay. That was a monument on your skin. That was one I haven't seen yet. Love it. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Jess, Paul, Courtenay, Kendall. Thank you also my colleagues, Julia and Sarah, for helping us run this. It's wonderful to be with you tonight and to talk about such important issues and ideas. Wanted to let you all know that Paul's works are both on view now. Public Trust is at moCa Cleveland until November 7th. And Eternal Flame, with its functional barbecues, is on view through March 2021 as part of Monuments Now at Socrates. Also wanted to throw out one more invite. Our three initial Monuments artists, Jeffrey Gibson, Paul Ramirez Jonas, and Zyveria Simmons, will be in conversation on November 13th at 1 p.m. and that is hosted by the Brooklyn Rail. Thank you everyone who tuned in and watched tonight. Great to be with you. Take care. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.